Before we start, a disclaimer. We're going to talk about suicide in this episode. And because of the unusual circumstances of this case, we'll be more descriptive about the suspected method than we normally would. We have to be, frankly, if we want to examine whether it was even possible. For those of you who struggle with thoughts of suicide, I'm a big believer in organizations like Crisis Text Line and the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. They exist to get you through the toughest days. As I like to say, no one reaches 80 and says they wish they killed themselves at 20. Things do get better. And now I'll move on. Previously on Accused.
When they were to tell you about the guy they found in the salt over in Plant 6, there was a pipe fitter, worked third shift, and he disappeared.
And he showed me this furnace, and it had molten salt in it. It just looked like lava. It always looked that way.
We made what I thought was a thorough search in the plant.
I just knew in my mind I was never going to get any resolution to it.
Nobody could have put him in there other than him putting himself in there.
I'm Amber Hunt, and this is Accused, the mysterious death of David Bocks. Former Hamilton County Sheriff's Detective Peter Alderucci doesn't equivocate when it comes to how David Bocks died.
I still think he committed suicide. I'd still say 100%.
No one who knew David well agrees, but that can happen when someone kills himself. People can hide depression. They can become masters at disguising the pain they feel inside. Loved ones can be blindsided, especially if there's no note. So imagine if there's no body. I can't know for sure whether David was suicidal. I never met him, so I wouldn't pretend to try. But I'll be upfront that I have trouble with the suicide theory. The reason I have trouble is the way David would have had to have done it.
What we determined that he wanted to commit suicide, he had to get back, run up those steps, and either jump or dive in that small opening.
Alderucci's theory, in short, is that David either dove or cannonballed into a vat of molten salt. It sounds awful, and we can debate the likelihood that anyone would choose to die in such a way, but that really wouldn't get us anywhere. To me, the bigger question is whether it was even physically possible. That's what we'll be looking at in today's episode. Before we talk about knocks against the suicide theory, let's explain the very reasonable reasons Alderucci put it on the table. To understand this, we have to go back to the 1970s when David's heavy drinking cost him his marriage.
It was my mom who decided who wanted the divorce, and of course my dad came from a very Catholic family and a strong-willed mother, and he didn't want it, but, he obliged.
That's Casey Drake Bocks, David's daughter. She says the divorce was as heartbreaking to David as it was a wake-up call. After his marriage imploded, David quit drinking alcohol cold turkey. In the throes of alcohol withdrawal, he started hallucinating while he was detoxing. Withdrawal can do that. It's serious stuff. David would say things that struck his brother Peter and their parents as odd, almost like somebody had crossed a few wires in his brain or knocked things out of order. This landed David on a hospital psychiatric ward, where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1976. While hospitalized, he told doctors he felt guilty about his divorce. He figured it was mostly his fault, he said, because he didn't spend enough time with his family. Once David was released, he worked hard to right things. He stayed friendly with his ex and moved in with his parents. The timing worked out because David's mom was ill, so he was there to help take care of her. She had a stroke and died in 1979. 7 months after his mom's death, David's brother Peter took him to the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. Peter told doctors that he thought David was struggling with their mother's death. But it was more than that. He was also butting heads with his father. Casey remembers that her dad and her grandfather were sometimes at odds. Her grandfather was
strong-willed New Yorker that, demanding. And my dad always tried to be the son that they loved the most, or at least in his opinion, which was his brother Paul. Could never live up to his brother Paul, none of them. So he felt really taken by that. So no matter what he did, he always felt that he was never good enough for my grandfather and grandmother because, he wasn't Paul, the given son.
Paul was the oldest of the three sons. He'd gone to college, gotten a graduate degree, then moved west and worked in computer sales. David and his other brother, Peter, just weren't as book smart as Paul. They both stayed in Ohio and got jobs their parents didn't boast about as often as Paul's. David especially was content with being a laborer. He didn't read much, but he was good with his hands. It always bothered him that his dad didn't seem to value that, Casey says. The hospital notes from this time period are in that language only psychiatrists use. David was in a state of internal disorganization, and he demonstrated psychotic thought blocking. I ran that through a Google translator of sorts, and it means he couldn't get his thoughts ordered enough to speak, so he would sometimes struggle to answer questions for up to a minute at a time. It's a common symptom of schizophrenia. The report also says David, quote, did not report hallucinations and said he had no thought of hurting himself or others, end quote. The doctor notes suggest his condition wasn't severe. He stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks and went home on a medication called Trilofan. About 3 months later, he was cooking a meal for his ex-wife and kids when he impulsively took 300 milligrams of Trilofan, nearly 10 times his prescribed dose of 32 milligrams. That landed him back in the hospital, though for a briefer stay. It was while he was there that time that David's dad died of emphysema, but the doctor's notes say he handled the news pretty well. If anything, it might have been a relief. This was early 1980, and it marks David's last hospitalization. His psychiatrist, Clifford Gruely III, wasn't convinced that Trilofan overdose was a genuine attempt to kill himself. It seemed to the doctor more like an impulsive cry for help. David stayed on his medication and continued regularly seeing the doctor, who gradually lowered David's dose of Trilofan to 8 milligrams. When police combed David's house after his disappearance, they found a prescription bottle with the appropriate number of pills missing for the month. It seemed David was still taking his medication regularly. The coworkers we interviewed had no clue he had been diagnosed with a mental illness. That isn't surprising, really, given the stigma attached and the fact that David wasn't much of a talker anyway. And besides, those hospitalizations came before David was even hired at Fernald. By 1984, he was, by all accounts, a hardworking, seemingly together man. It was tough not living with his kids, but he wasn't alone. He and his brother inherited their parents' house and lived together up until the year before David's death. At that point, David refinanced the house just enough to buy Peter's half so Peter could move in with his wife and stepchildren. David's kids were shielded from his psychiatric issues, but his daughter Casey would eventually find and file notes from David's psychiatrist, who has since died. For years, she kept the notes, as well as a bunch of other documents, in a box she labeled Dad's Death Box. Before she let Amanda and I borrow the box for this project, she scribbled the label out, worried it might creep us out. It didn't. Dr. Gruely's notes describe a sensitive man who wanted to be well. He told police he had last seen David in April, and everything had been stable for years since that last hospitalization. In fact, Gruely said, he often talked about David as one of his success stories. David had rebounded so fully, so heartily, that Gruely bragged about him. He was shocked by the death and dubious David would kill himself. Casey was too, and she still is today. Her memories of her father aren't of a withdrawn, depressed man. Yes, he had struggled during and after the divorce, but he and Carlene, that's Casey's mother's name, were comfortably co-parenting, as they call it today.
They were cordial. They worked everything out. If my dad was a little short on money to pay for child support, my mom, they worked everything out very well. You hear of so many people that have divorce, they're at each other's throats, in front of the kids, behind the kids, around the kids. They had a very good divorce relationship that I could tell.
David didn't date after his divorce. He led a life that was a lot like his personality. Quiet. One Fernald employee remembered poking fun at David at work.
The reason I used to kid him, he used to see he was required to take a shower.
Required twice, in fact, at the start and end of each shift to curtail contamination.
You had to wear shower shoes. He never wore any. I told him, I said, you're going to cut your feet off one of these days. And he used to go through there barefooted.
That was George Bissett, one of David's co-workers. Harry Easterling was another. He was, in fact, the guy who carpooled with David most shifts. He remembered David as nice, if not chatty. The night of the disappearance, Harry last saw David at lunchtime. Because this was third shift, their lunch break was around 4 a.m. Harry told police David was quiet that lunch, but no more than usual. They ate without saying much. Eating together were Harry, David, and a supervisor of theirs named Charlie Schaus. Harry's the one who left the written notes for David saying, "Sorry, I waited as long as I could." 35 years later, he still struggled to understand what could have happened that night. Here's us talking in January 2019. Was there anything in his state of mind, including, maybe seeming happier than usual, that...
Okay, let me tell you this. He had just bought a new lunchbox. I guess he bought it that day before we went into work, because when we went upstairs to eat, he was like, "Hey, where'd you get that, man?" "Oh, I just bought this. It's my new lunchbox." And I'm thinking, why, if the guy was going to jump in something like that, kill himself, would he go buy a brand new lunchbox? But, they say people do weird things when they're contemplating suicide.
That's true. Yeah, I talked to a pathologist about a different case, and he said, survivors often think of, why rationally would he have done X, Y, and Z? And he's like, well, you can't apply ration because suicide is irrational. Okay, so I always have trouble.
And he was going to take his kids on vacation, too.
Yeah. So what is your gut? What do you think happened?
I got a clue. I never did figure out what happened.
The people who knew him outside of work all said the same thing. Even if David had crossed the threshold into suicidal thoughts and hid it, there's no way he would have done it by throwing himself into a vat of molten salt. Who would do that? Like I said, though, that's not really the question I want to answer. What I want to know is, was it even possible?
From Black Friday hangovers and winter closet splurges to unwanted gifts and tons of trashed wrapping paper, our favorite season also happens to be one of the most stressful and wasteful times of the year. ThredUp, the world's largest online thrift store, is here to help. Because whether you're shopping for yourself or for a loved one, choosing used instead of new means you're being gentler on your wallet and the planet. There's something for everyone at ThredUp. You can score Coach handbags for $25, Free People dresses for $13, Madewell jeans for $25, and even J.Crew sweaters for just $20. All items are up to 90% off estimated retail, and they're also all in high-quality condition. Some even have the tags still on. I was blown away by the volume of the selection on ThredUp's website. But even after I filtered for my size, budget, and style, there was still so much great stuff to choose from. Just for listeners of Accused, here's a little extra holiday cheer. Get 30% off your first order at thredup.com/accused. That's 30% off your first order at threadup, threadup.com/accused. Try threadup today. Terms apply.
And now back to our story.
Yeah, that's not going anywhere. I also wonder if we should hammer this down.
On a hot July day, a group of coworkers and I gathered together on my front lawn with a stack of 2x4s, a box of screws, and power tools. Our goal was to build a big old rectangular box with an opening matching the dimensions of the salt vat at Fernald. We would have loved to have seen the vat itself, but it was destroyed more than 20 years ago. All we have left are photographs and sketches, which luckily included measurements. We also have the memories of former workers.
It just looked like hell. I mean, it just looked like, well, if you're going to look down at hell and there was a big hole in the ground, that's what it looked like. Big open red hole in the ground.
That's Harry again. In total, Harry worked at Fernald for about 5 years and had seen the salt vat in Plant 6 plenty of times. He describes it as a hole in the ground, but in reality it was a few feet off the ground. Workers would sometimes gather to look at it, he said. The slurry inside glowed cherry red.
Like lava?
Like a volcano, yeah.
Here are the dimensions given in police reports. The vat was 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, and 10.5 feet long. Its walls were thick. Its insides were only accessible from the top, which was usually covered by a long lid that protected most of the opening. I say most because even when the lid was on, it didn't quite reach the top edge of the vat on one side. That opening was too small to be really useful, so a huge piece of equipment sat nearby that workers would use to hook onto a handle in the center of the lid and lift it off. Once the vat was open, the uranium ingots, described in episode 1, could be lowered inside. Harry sounded scared of the vat, but some of the workers had fun with it.
But it's been said that some people would take apples over there. And in order to get rid of the apple core, they would pitch it up into the salt bath tank, which was pretty effective.
This is Jesse Sosby, a former Fernald worker, interviewed for the Living History Project in 1999. When he says the salt bath was effective at getting rid of the apple cores, he's understating things a bit. It gets a little sciencey, but the gist is that the vat was so ungodly hot that the water content in the fruit would get zapped nearly instantly, causing a small explosion.
The only problem was there was enough moisture in that apple core that when it hit that hot salt, it would react and it would put salt on the top, on the roof of Plant 6. It would go off like a shotgun, like a very large shotgun. So, boy, it took care of the apple core. They lost a little salt in the process, too.
It wasn't always fruit they used. Here's Melvin Doc Cleater.
We'd have these rubber gloves we'd wear, and you'd fill them up with water. You take a little rubber glove and throw it in the furnace, man, it'd pop like a cannon going off. Once in a while, people would get a little playful mood, with no supervisor around, and they'd throw one of these in the furnace, man, it'd pop in and go off like a shotgun. Them bosses, they'd come flying out of the office, right there next door. They'd be where it's cool. We'd be out there working. And I'd say, what happened? What? Didn't hear anything. I don't know what happened. Well, they'd go back in there and they'd shake their heads,
Now, you know how hot you can get when you stand next to your oven while you're cooking? That's usually in the 300 to 400 degree range. Standing next to this vat was uncomfortable, especially for any real length of time. The plant didn't have special suits for the workers to wear while near this thing, and they generally didn't need them. When they would lower the ingots, they'd do it from a distance using special industrial equipment. Harry remembers there was a ladder that you could theoretically use to climb to reach the top. Not that he ever saw anyone using it.
Except they don't call it a ladder, they call it a stairway. And it was, you could walk up the stairway and then go around the outside edge of it.
And would that be comfortable, or would you be getting hot?
Then you would be getting hot.
How hot? Like I'm in a sauna, or I'm going to jump into a volcano? Okay.
In a sauna.
So uncomfortable but bearable.
Right.
For the record, this isn't how Alderucci remembers it. The detective recalls it being far too hot to even stand next to the vat. But we've talked to several workers who agree with Harry's memory. This thing was not pleasant, but it was possible to stand by it for a short length of time. Regardless, what the various people agree on is arguably the most important aspect. The opening that allowed access to the 1,350-degree slurry inside was small. Really small. It measured about 22 inches wide and 9 inches deep. Basically, if you take 2 sheets of paper and tape them together lengthwise, add just half an inch to the short side and you've got the opening's depth. Now imagine fitting your body into that. We used tape to mark the opening on the floor of the accused war room and then asked a male coworker nearby to stand on top of it. It looked awfully tight, but maybe possible. To really test it, I decided we had to do our best to build a replica. I bought 2x4s and 4x4s from Home Depot and asked a worker there to cut them to the right measurements. It was an interesting project to explain. Then my colleagues from work gathered at my house. Amanda was there, of course, accused editor Amy Wilson, accused intern Mark Rosenberg, and Enquirer News intern Josh Goad. I'd sent out a note to the newsroom looking for someone roughly David Bocks' measurements. Josh was the closest to volunteer. He wasn't a perfect match, though. David was supposedly between 180 and 200 pounds and about 6 feet tall. Josh is about the right weight at around 180 pounds, but he's 6'4" rather than 6 feet. In short, he's skinnier than David was. If he fit, it might not mean that David would, but if he didn't, well, that would make it hard to imagine David could cannonball into that hole. The 5 of us used 4x4s as posts and created a rectangular box that was 4 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and 6 feet long. The measurements all lined up with the real vat except the length. The real vat was 10.5 feet long, but evidence of David entering the vat was only near the opening anyway, so I didn't feel it was too critical to the experiment. I opted to spare the extra trees. Home Depot had done all of the rough cuts for me, but I needed to hand cut the vat opening myself. I used a hunk of plywood to simulate the cover, and then used circular and jigsaws to slice in an opening of 22 by 9 inches. Then we screwed the plywood to the top of our fake vat and grabbed a ladder. Mark, the accused intern, got the inaugural attempt because favoritism. He's slim and 5'9", so far smaller than David.
And do you think I should go in facing this way or like turned and facing?
You know, I would face this way because then you can brace your body.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And I'm going to help. Yeah, do not try to jump in. Just ease yourself in.
All right.
He'd made it inside, but only by keeping his body stiff and perfectly upright. And even then, it was tight around his torso. Next came Josh, who's slightly closer in proportions to David.
Like I'm getting, it's hard right here.
Shoulders. Yeah, keep going.
What would he have done? He would have been head first, wouldn't he? So he would have been.
Would he have been head first? That's the only way. He couldn't get his lower half into the hole without shimmying his rear back and forth, the way you might if you were trying to force on a pair of too tight jeans. His shoulders were an even tighter fit. Because Alderucci said his theory was that David either jumped or dove, we had Josh try, carefully, to enter our vat hands first. That made it even harder.
Can you get your head through there?
I can. I just,
Don't want to?
I need to be able to touch the ground, which I'm probably able to in a few seconds.
What we're saying, is...
There's no, you couldn't dive in just for the fact that, like, once...
The bending.
Yeah, it would...
The bending wouldn't work.
You couldn't even, like,
the bending wouldn't work. Because you're going to have you're going to be curved.
Yeah, exactly.
Your upper neck would get caught. Your shoulders would be. You would be like right here.
No, your head would explode,
your
and
arms.
then
you would
you'd
be laying here.
Or it would stay there.
The volume of your body is over on this side.
It bothered us that we hadn't seen a great full-body picture of David to really get a sense of his size. His son Tony thinks the 180 to 200 pound estimate was a bit low even. He put his dad closer to 220. This is Casey again.
He was kind of built like, what is that actor's name? Played in 48 Hours. Nick Nolte.
Okay.
Built kind of like that.
Current Nick Nolte or old Nick Nolte? Because he used to kind of be...
About the size he was in 48 Hours.
Okay, all right. I spent weeks eyeing my male coworkers in a way that should have landed me in human resources, but luckily, everyone was understanding once I explained. Finally, after probably a dozen inappropriate questions for weights and heights, we found Tyler Dragon. He's the Enquirer's lead Bengals reporter. He's 6'2" and 230 pounds, slightly heavier than David, but also slightly taller. His proportions are very close to how Tony described his dad.
He wasn't quite as tall as I am. He was about an inch shorter than I was.
And you're what?
I'm 6'2" and a half. He was about 6'1".
Okay.
He was a pipe fitter, so he had really, really big upper body strength in his shoulders and his chest. He was bulky in his chest, arms. Stocky guy. Okay. Real stocky guy. Strong as an ox.
I can fit.
All right, so you got his waist through.
But it takes a bit of maneuvering. Like you went in one leg at a time.
Yeah, there's no way I can
with some maneuvering with your hands on the side and shifting shoulder to shoulder.
Actually, do you mind going back like from the under so I can see how tight it is on the shoulders?
Yeah, like I mean I can get through, but there are touching.
Yeah. These experiments did not assuage my doubts. In each case, the volunteer could fit, but not without wiggling. There's another thing to keep in mind, too. Whether David could physically pull off this specific method of suicide is about more than whether he could cram his body into a small opening. It's also about whether he could do that virtually without a trace while entering a vat of lava so hot that it made apple cores explode upon impact. Excuse this quick break. The episode you're listening to now was released already on our Patreon page at patreon.com/accused. You can get early ad-free episodes there, as well as bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes peeks, Q&A sessions, and even a brand new crime and journalism podcast. If you like what we do here, consider joining us over there. For this episode, we're releasing video and photos from our efforts to build a replica of the vat in which David Bocks' remains were discovered. Again, for this content and more, support us at patreon.com/accused. This part of the episode is going to describe the supposed how of David's death if the suicide theory is correct. Normally, we wouldn't go into this kind of detail. Experts say suicide contagion is real, and the risk of a copycat increases when you're explicit about the method. We don't expect many people have access to a 1,350-degree vat of potassium chloride and sodium chloride mixed together, and we think it's important to understand the physics of what would have happened in order to weigh the likelihood that it did. So bear with us here while we focus on the how rather than the who. And be warned, it gets pretty complicated, so I'll do my best to keep things simple. As mentioned earlier, when workers toss fruit into the vat, they would explode. An apple is about 65% water. A human body is about 90%. Obviously, there's never been a controlled experiment in which a living human was tossed into a substance like this. Fernald never even had a comparable accident to shed light on how things might have happened. It's all conjecture, but it's not uneducated conjecture. As part of the original investigation, David's bosses commissioned a scientist named D.B. Katz to posit how the slurry would have reacted to David's body entering it. Or, as Katz more fancily says, quote, calculate the expected temperature effects resulting from the immersion of a human body in the molten salt bath, end quote. And I thought autopsies were too clinical sounding. Katz came up with 4 scenarios. and then did some sciencey math stuff to figure out how many degrees the slurry would have dipped if that's really how the salt bath had reacted to David's body. He wanted to see which scenario resulted in a temperature dip that lined up the closest with what was actually recorded. Follow me so far? We're looking for the temp to dip to 1,322 degrees. Scenario 1. Once the body was immersed, it quickly heated up to match the slurry's temperature, and then the water inside the body evaporated. If that had been how the slurry reacted to David entering it, the temperature in the vat should have dropped 109 degrees to 1241. That's too big a dip. Scenario 2. The body's water evaporates before it heats up enough to reach the slurry's temperature. The temperature drop in that case is 49 degrees, down to 1301. Still too big a drop. Those first two scenarios are pretty straightforward because they don't figure in the resistance heaters. This gets complicated, but it has to do with the way the molten salt was heated in the first place. There were these electrodes immersed inside, and the vat was designed to stay a constant temperature. So as David's body lowered the slurry's temp, those electrodes would have been fighting to raise it back up. That was their whole job. As soon as the temperature dropped just 2 degrees, those heaters kicked on and worked to heat things up again. So scenario 3 is just like scenario 1, but with the formula tweaked to assume the electrodes did their job. The temperature would have dropped 75 degrees to 1275. Remember, we're looking for the 1320 range, so this dip is still too big. Scenario 4 added the electrode hoopla to scenario 2. The water in David's body evaporated without reaching the slurry's temperature first. This would have dropped the temperature 15 degrees to 1355. If we're looking for 1322, now we're too high. The final scenario is number 5, which takes the first theory, that David's body heated up to 1350 before the water evaporated, plus the resistance heaters adding heat, plus one more thing. Remember how apples would explode? Yeah, this scenario assumed that the non-water portion of David's body would have combusted the way the apples did. That would have dropped the temperature 62 degrees, making the final bath temperature 1,288. Now we're too low again. Katz, the scientist whose math you just endured, wrote in his memo that he thought David's body would have exploded like the apples. Or as he said it, quote, "Scenario number 5 is expected to most closely approximate the actual bizarre events postulated to have occurred at the salt bath furnace," end quote. It perplexed him that his temperature calculations didn't line up with that scenario. The fourth scenario, the water in David's body evaporated before it reached 1350 degrees and the resistance heaters did their jobs, is the one that comes closest, but it's still more than 30 degrees off, and it clearly wasn't the scenario Katz thought was most likely. Those apples, they would hit the slurry and the water inside would evaporate so quickly that the non-water part of the apple combusted. It was violent. Katz thought that's what would have happened to David too. And there's reason to think that it kind of did. The underside of the vat's lid was coated by that thick, dark material that none of the workers had ever seen before. It was like a crustier version of the black sludge found on top of the actual slurry. Investigators figured that when the body hit the slurry, the water evaporated quickly and the non-water parts combusted, leaving their mark on the lid. The vat was only 4 feet deep, and David was 6 feet tall. From our experiments, the only way David could possibly have fit through the opening was to enter completely upright. He couldn't have dove at an angle. He was too broad to enter that way. He couldn't have cannonballed either. Even if his aim had been perfect, his hips and rear would have gotten stuck in the entrance. You would think that both of these ways in would have been messy, leaving bits of clothing or bone or flesh on the outside of the vat. None of that was found. The only thing mentioned outside of the vat in the reports was a small bit of the black sludge. Otherwise, there's nothing amiss on the outside. There's another issue, too. As explained in episode 1, the temperature in the vat dipped 2 distinct times within a short time period. That implies that something entered 2 separate times. So, for just a second, let's set aside the opening size for a minute and assume it was big enough for David. If you envision David's body entering and getting dissolved, suicide seems hellish, but plausible. David jumps in legs first, the bottom half of him disintegrates, and once it's gone, the top half slides through the hole and follows suit. Therefore, his body enters in halves and you get 2 dips. But if Dr. Katz was right, the body wouldn't have just simply dissolved. It would have exploded. How could it have combusted but left no clothing fragments, no bones, no bits of flesh or appendages? When something that big explodes, would it really stay so self-contained? Trusting Dr. Katz's calculations, the slurry temperature dipped too much for that scenario. So what if David's full body didn't go in at once? If half of his 180 to 200 pound body went in first, then the second half went in a bit later, how would that affect the numbers? Unfortunately, Katz's memo didn't include any equations for us to provide another scientist to double check. In high school science speak, he didn't show his work. Still, I wanted to chat with a scientist to at least run these scenarios past someone other than Katz. I found a physiologist whose expertise looked like it would be helpful, and then I sent him the most bizarre and morbid email I've probably ever sent.
My name is Christopher Minson. I'm a professor at University of Oregon in the Department of Human Physiology.
And you weirded out all your colleagues by asking about my my query. So.
I weirded out a lot of people. 1 or 2 people actually said, I can't even talk about this.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's funny.
Okay, welcome to my life.
Exactly. Well, one of them said, I'm a very visual person. I can't do this. I was like, I'm a visual person too, but I still want to do it. So,
well, thank you very much for taking the time and not being too weirded out when I emailed. I sent Minson the memo that Katz had drafted. After mulling the scenarios and chatting with colleagues for a few days, he talked on the phone with me about his thoughts.
I found that really, really interesting, and I think they did a very good job as far as looking through and identifying the potential effects of dropping a body into 1,350 degree temperature and seeing the temperature drop from that, and it kind of matched the right size.
He found the second dip especially curious. It's possible, he said, that the first dip was from David's body being immersed initially, and then the second dip was when the moisture evaporated from his body.
I would have thought that it would evaporate faster than that, or be almost instantaneous, but it's pretty clear that that's not the case. And so I thought that was really compelling, and certainly the evaporative cooling power is strong. And so that again, matched what they said as far as that body went in there. It seems to be for sure.
Minson disagreed with Katz on one key point. He's less inclined to think a human body would explode once in the solution because human skin isn't as thick as apple skin.
I would suspect it would behave differently simply because our skin is a tissue more than more of a hard casing, like especially the watermelon. Right? In that case, it's going to evaporate the water inside and expand it so fast that it's going to explode outside the shell. We don't really have a hard shell. Our skin definitely the skin, as soon as the skin touches, it's going to start blistering and the water in the skin is going to evaporate out. It's conceivable that could happen, but I've never heard anything about people spontaneously exploding in that kind of regard or any kind of tissue.
I haven't heard of that either, but then I've never heard of anything analogous to this scenario, period. The closest thing I could think of would be someone dying in what Harry Easterling said the slurry looked like, lava. That's how I found Adam Kent, a volcanologist with Oregon State University. He said he's asked surprisingly frequently what would happen if a human went into a volcano, so he'd already given it a fair amount of thought before he got my query.
I guess it's one of those bizarre, slightly macabre subjects that gets the imagination going.
He directed me online to a video of someone tossing a bag of what's described as organic waste into a volcano. First, you hear a pop, like a gunshot as the bag of waste drops through the top layer of black molten rock and causes a stream of glowing red lava to burst through. The camera recording this is too far away to capture the rest of the sound, but you can see a series of explosions force more and more lava out, opening a huge hole in the crusty top layer. Kent explains,
Any water in a human body or other wet material would pretty much very quickly, if not instantaneously, turn to steam. That steam would be under much higher pressure than the liquid water was, and it would try and escape. The lava retards that, and then so you get basically you get sort of pressure release explosions because the pressure can't be released fast enough. Sort of the inertia of the lava is so much it can't get out of the road of the steam soon enough, and you get some explosions.
This is why I fall in the probably exploded camp. Though without conducting a gruesome test myself, I wanted to note that smart people can disagree on this theory. Back in 1984, the focus seemed to be on how the slurry might react to a human body, but I wanted to know how David's body might have reacted to the slurry. If he'd gone in feet first, would he have bled, vomited, passed out, been able to shimmy into that opening? Minson said that whatever part of David's body went in first likely would have been cauterized, meaning the searing heat of the slurry would seal the wound and prevent bleeding. Meanwhile, the moisture in the tissue would have been evaporating incredibly quickly. It would have been extremely painful, so painful that David might have passed out straight away. And that would have been a blessing, because had David been conscious, he would have been in unbelievable pain.
I can't imagine someone being able to tolerate that level of pain, getting themselves in slowly. So, long story short, I guess I can say is I'd be really surprised if someone lowered themselves into this willingly, with the level of pain and all the other associated aspects of the mental side of it. That would be so difficult.
If David couldn't shimmy, how would he have managed to fit himself so perfectly into that small hole? If your brain hurts from all the hypotheticals, I completely understand. I've been mulling this for months. The truth is, without throwing a body into molten salt, we can't really know what would happen to one. Yet, Alderucci, the investigator, is 100% sure to this day that David killed himself. I asked him why he was so certain.
You couldn't get close enough to it when the furnace was on, when it was in a dormant state, but like at night when they were using it, you couldn't get within 10 feet of it. It'd be so hot, you would just burn to death. So nobody could have killed him, carried him up. There were steps going up at the end of the salt furnace. What we determined that he wanted to commit suicide, he had to get back, run up those steps, and either jump or dive in that small opening.
That's the same reason David's family is sure he wouldn't have killed himself in this horribly unpleasant way. And here it's being used as proof by the detective that it's the only way he could have died. And the only way that Alderucci believes it's possible is if David dove or cannonballed in the two ways that our front yard experiment convinced us couldn't have happened. Did you look at the possibility of homicide at all?
We had no reason to. You think that, but there was no indication, no evidence to show of any homicide. He was despondent. We knew that. He was having psychological problems.
Can I push back a little?
Sure.
Because his last psychological episode had been years earlier. His family all said he was fine.
He still had to end up in that furnace. And nobody could have put him in there. That's the thing. Nobody could have put him in there other than him putting himself in there.
If he had been, say, there was a fight and he's punched, somebody else could have carried him up there, right?
They couldn't carry him up there. It was too hot. Nobody could get that close to put him in there. That's the thing. That was the main thing that we were questioning. How could anybody put him in there? They don't have heat-resistant suits at Fernald to get close enough to that. There's just nobody could have carried him in. That space was so close, they put him in there, it had to splash. Because what happens, just like if you have a skillet with grease on it, you throw some water on it, it pops and it splatters all over. That's what happens. Because the workers used to take watermelons and pieces of a watermelon and throw them in, and boom, they would explode. That would human bodies are going to do the same. So if somebody was that close to do that, they would have been burnt. If they could have gotten that close, and they couldn't. It was just too hot.
I told him it didn't seem a logical place to kill oneself. He countered,
But I've seen a lot of people kill themselves in a lot of, I've investigated a lot of suicides. Sure. And people do it in very illogical ways. Even people that know better, doctors, people like that, they kill themselves in some very strange ways.
I don't mean to be graphic here, but what have you seen?
Saw a lady right before Christmas when her whole family was coming to her house, open up her freezer. She had a standalone freezer, got inside and closed the door, just locked herself into it, die that way. Right before everybody's coming to her house.
Did she leave a note? Is that
nope,
why you're...
Nothing.
I tried to ask how he was so sure this freezer death wasn't an accident, but he went on to describe a few other scenes he'd worked on, and we moved on. I do agree that lack of logic can't be used to rule out a suicide method. It's not always a logical act. It's often too impulsive for that. The New England Journal of Medicine says that anywhere between 1/3 to 4/5 of all suicide attempts are impulsive. In interviews with people who survived their attempts, the journal found that 24% took less than 5 minutes between the decision to kill themselves and the actual attempt. 70% took less than 1 hour. So the science says it's possible, maybe even likely, that if David put himself in that furnace, it wasn't a planned out action. It's possible an urge suddenly hit him and he did something rash. I concede that Florida vacation plans, a new lunchbox, and a full fridge of food might not be solid evidence he couldn't have made a spur-of-the-moment decision. But when I look at the tiny opening of my homemade salt vat, I can't imagine anyone over age 10 thinking they could fit into that hole. I asked Minson, the physiologist. Okay. So when you're talking to people, what's the percentage of people who go, suicide versus no?
Yeah, I'd say almost to a person, everyone said not suicide.
Oh, really? Oh, I wasn't expecting that definitive. All right.
Yeah, I think a lot of people thought it was either the person was killed and put in there, and to be so almost impossible to get a conscious human into that. I was a little surprised by that too, because I was thinking, initially that there could be some evidence for suicide, but boy, if you're gonna, I guess if you wanted to really have your body disappear completely, that would probably be a way to go at it, but to actually think about the pain that the person would go through consciously to drop themselves in it. And, cannonball diving into that kind of solution, I can't see how you can have that good enough aim and hope to get it right.
The bottom line for me is that while it might have been physically possible David put himself in that vat, the likelihood seems slim. I'm generally an Occam's razor kind of gal. The simplest solution is almost always the right one. Is suicide in this case possible? I'd never say no. But likely? Likely enough to completely bypass any chance of murder? That's a tough sell. David's family never believed he killed himself, but they were as certain as they could be that he was dead. Nearly 2 years after the disappearance, his family tried to get him declared legally dead. It was the only way that his kids could be awarded his pension and life insurance, or even consider suing his bosses for wrongful death. Usually, someone has to be missing for 5 years before they're declared dead. But with bones in the furnace, they thought there was no point in waiting it out. They were sure David wasn't coming back. A judge sided with the family, and David was declared dead 22 months after he disappeared. Then the family decided they wanted to sue for workers' compensation. If he died a work-related death, his kids could stake claim on death benefits. This is where the suicide theory really picks up steam, and for pretty cynical reasons. First, let's back up. On June 27th, 1984, less than 10 days after David disappeared, a company safety engineer named W.M. Edwards submitted an informal review of David's disappearance from the NLO plant. It's typed, single-spaced, and 3 pages long. In it, the engineer seems to cast at least a shadow of doubt on David having died inside the vat at all. It reads, quote, Currently, there is evidence, but no proof, except for the radio and keys found in the bath, that would tie Mr. Box's disappearance to the findings in the furnace, end quote. Edwards points out that while there was bone-like material found, they couldn't confirm it was bone at all, much less human bone. The report points out, too, that the furnace was pretty far off the ground. David would have had to climb on top, endure the heat, and then work to enter the tank through the small opening. Edwards says bluntly, quote, "There appears to be no reasonable way that Mr. Bocks could have accidentally gotten into the salt bath. On the contrary, it would have required a very determined mental and physical effort on his part to accomplish this act," end quote. So the report, in short, says maybe David wasn't in the vat, and if he was, he didn't just slip. He would have had to have been incredibly determined to put himself in there. Now back to the lawsuit. Casey says her family wanted to sue the company for wrongful death, but the lawyers they hired talked them out of that.
The lawyers that we had wanted to go after workman's comp. They thought that that was the best route because he died in the course of work. Well, you know, that's where they're fighting, oh, hell no, he committed suicide. We're not paying nothing. So that's where the suicide thing comes in because workman's comp is like, hell with you.
After all, suicide at work isn't considered a work-related death. Casey's interpretation seems fair. Internal memos are far less certain David killed himself. But when NLO officials took the stand to testify in the workman's comp case, they answered resolutely and in lockstep. Nope, the kids shouldn't get death benefits because David definitely killed himself. David's family at first figured that money was the only motivator. The company was being cheap, they thought. But the more they learned about the Fernald plant, the more suspicious they got.
We always felt that they should have actually gone after the company, but that's when we all found out that it was owned by the federal government.
And the federal government had been keeping some pretty big secrets about the plant. Secrets that David's kids think he might have threatened to expose. Next time on Accused.
The atomic bomb flash could burn you worse than a terrible sunburn, especially where you're not covered.
So the EPA letter came back pretty quick and said, find another source of drinking water.
It seems so mundane, yet it seems so evil at the same time.
To binge this season, go to www.wondery.com/plus. That's WONDERY.com/PLUS. To support the creators of Accused directly, go to our Patreon page where donors get bonus content and early episodes. That's at patreon.com/accused. This is a special project from the Cincinnati Enquirer, part of the USA Today Network, narrated by Amber Hunt, produced by Amanda Rossman, engineered by Phil Didion, and edited by Amy Wilson. Intern Mark Rosenberg provided additional research. Music was composed by Andrew Higley. To look at case documents, photos, videos, and more, visit accusedpodcast.com. As noted, some audio comes from a living history project from the Fernald Community Alliance. Transcript to those interviews are available at fernaldcommunityalliance.org.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, check out these other videos from USA Today to stay up to date with all the latest news.